Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 28 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars. Whenever a report in the media addresses electric vehicle product delays or scarce inventory levels or price increases, the villain is almost always connected in some way to the automotive supply chain. In today's episode, we'll take a deep dive and look at the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead for EV manufacturers working in the Canadian market. Jason Arnaud is back once again to review your questions and to present them following today's presentation. As always, please use Zoom's Q&A tool to put in your questions. And remember, upvote any questions you see there that interest you and that you'd like to have answered. That way we won't run out of time before we get to your question. As usual, we'll end today's broadcast no later than 8:30. Today, we welcome Matthew Fortier, President and CEO of the Accelerate Alliance, to Canada Talks Electric Cars. He'll discuss why it's important to determine what success really looks like for Canadian zero-emission vehicle industry and what it might take to achieve that success. Accelerate represents key public and private sector stakeholders in Canada's zero-emission vehicle supply chain. Accelerate is a national alliance with a mandate to organize and align Canada's ZEV supply chain to ensure its growth and its success. Prior to his current role at Accelerate, Matthew was Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs at the Institute of Corporate Directors, where he led content and strategy development on matters of public policy, legislation, and regulation, including, of course, sustainability and climate change. Prior to that, Matthew was an executive at Resound and directed the policy and government relations strategies surrounding Canadian intellectual property. Matthew began his career in federal politics and holds a master's from Goldsmiths College, University of London, and a director designation from the Rotman School of Business. Hey, Matthew, welcome to the webinar.
Tim, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, no, we're really looking forward to this one. Really want to hear about the current market and what the production challenges are faced by the EV manufacturers in our country, and especially as we try to attempt to seize Canada's zero-emission vehicle opportunities. So I'm going to get out of your way, Matthew, and let you take it from here.
Listen, thanks so much, Tim, and thanks to everybody for joining this evening. I think what I'll do is I'll spend a little bit of time talking about Accelerate, what we are, how we were founded, and why we were founded, and then maybe try on a vision for the audience, float that by you and see if that resonates. And following that, I'll sort of set the context for that vision. Why are we talking about this today? What is the opportunity in front of us? And talk about the opportunity specifically for Canada. And then I want to discuss some of the challenges that we face as we try to seize that opportunity. And then, maybe revisit the vision that I set out at the front end and talk about maybe how we can overcome some of those challenges, what we need to do to achieve that vision. So hopefully this slide deck works. There we go. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about what Accelerate is. We're a national alliance, as Tim pointed out, that launched at the end of last year. And really what we were formed to do was to bring together companies and trade associations and trade unions, environmental NGOs, everybody involved in some way, shape, or form in the zero-emission vehicle supply chain. So that's critical mineral mining and rare earth mining through to battery research and development and manufacturing through to AI and technological solutions, auto parts manufacturers, and of course, auto manufacturers themselves. The idea is that together, these stakeholders can work with each other and with government to really accelerate and catalyze the supply chain in Canada and really help Canada lean into the zero-emission vehicle production cycle. And the way we're doing this is we're approaching this in 6 different ways. And we've got 6 different action areas. The first is to build a roadmap for the country, figure out what success looks like for Canada in this space. You know, what are we going to be good at? What are we not going to do? Where are we going to spend our time and money and resources, you know, excelling on a global scale? 2 is to advocate to government, work with government really on those policy instruments, both at the federal and the provincial levels. That will support the catalyzation of a zero-emission vehicle supply chain in the country. You know, we work together with our companies and our members to enable collaboration. So introducing the upstream to the midstream to the downstream, so that partnerships can be formed and relationships can be built across the entire value chain. And we work to promote economic benefits of a zero-emission vehicle supply chain to Canadians. What would this mean for our industrial future as we transition away from one locus of industry to other loci? You know, what will that mean? How are we going to do it? Why is this important? How are we going to generate wealth for future generations of Canadians so that we can have the same standard of living for our children and our grandchildren that we've enjoyed? You know, what industries are we going to really create? This is one of those that we think is going to be a really important part of our future. And finally, you know, working with various stakeholders, particularly governments, on helping to create that pipeline of talent that we're going to need to really make a strong mark in the global zero-emission vehicle supply chain. So that's, you know, attracting people from abroad, obviously, but it's also developing the skills here within Canada and helping people transition to those new skilled jobs that will come online in the near future. So I want to try on this vision. The vision that I have is that Canada will be a global zero-emission vehicle giant in 2040. So I just want to sort of stop and maybe, you know, take a breath and let people sort of, you know, think about that for a second. Canada will be a global giant in 2040. We don't talk like that in Canada very much about any industry. We've been blessed with a whole bunch of things in this country, and we'll talk about some of those things later on, including natural resources and good governance. And we've enjoyed a very high standard of living relative to everywhere else in the world. So we haven't really had to think too much about being globally competitive and winning on a global scale. But we think that this is an area where Canada can be not only competitive, but it can be, as I say, a giant. But we need to think about what that looks like. So does that mean that Canada is going to be a major producer of the critical minerals and rare earth minerals that are needed to build the batteries of future and the motors and magnets and the lightweight alloys, you know, and process those minerals as well? Is that what that means? Does it mean that we're going to be a global leader in battery research and development and manufacturing? You know, how about, you know, a leading designer and producer of zero-emission vehicle parts, right? So the new parts that are needed. And keep in mind that there are thousands of parts that go into an internal combustion engine vehicle, and there are far fewer, hundreds, sometimes dozens in the motors anyway. So, you know, are we going to be producing the best materials and parts? Are we going to be a global hub for battery recycling? We already have some really interesting projects and companies in Canada doing some great work and that are competing globally. Are we going to double down on that and be a leader in recycling? You know, are we going to provide and export the charging infrastructure expertise and equipment of the future? Are we going to be a really significant manufacturer of zero-emission vehicles? We already have, obviously, an incredibly important auto industry that we'll talk about in a second. Are we going to maintain that and grow it? Well, how about maintaining it and growing it and making sure that it has a certain percentage of Canadian content within each vehicle? You know, is that where we want to go? You know, is it some of these? Is it all of these? We have to think about that. That's really, you know, what Accelerate was formed to do. And the reason we were formed to do it is because, and I don't need to tell this audience, there is a huge disruption that we're all living right now. You know, it's pushed by, you know, our need to get to net zero by 2050. This is a non-negotiable objective. This is something that we need to do for all the reasons that we know. But that disruption, you know, is disrupting our auto industry, and that transition is pretty much the biggest transition that we've seen in that industry since the invention of the internal combustion engine. And you know, as we all know, you know, this audience in particular, you know, jurisdictions around the world, including here in Canada, have adopted sales targets to phase out ICE engine vehicles within 10 to 15 years. So that's a huge disruption for an important industry in this country. So let's talk about that global shift a little bit more granular detail. So, right now globally, it might be a little bit more than this. These numbers are, about 18 months old, but 11 million, maybe 11 to 15 million passenger battery electric vehicles on the road globally. By 2030, best case scenario, best case for uptake is 230 million. So think of that shift from 11 million to 230 million in 10 years. That is a huge, huge change in how we get around globally. Even the kind of the low case scenario is 145 million. So that means a huge surge in battery demand, right? So 7 years ago, the demand was 59 gigawatt hours. Last year, 400, this year, 600. This is exponential growth. This is huge, and it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger as more vehicles come online. So these charts just really, demonstrate that a little bit more. You can sort of see the huge and rapid surge in uptake that we're going to see over the coming 10, well, really only 8 years now. This is, the chart on the left is sort of the worst case scenario or the scenario that we would see under the stated policies of governments worldwide, and the chart on the right is the best case scenario in terms of uptake if things break the right way. So you can just sort of see this just kind of shows you how important this growth is and how rapidly it's happening. And why is it? Well, we all know that mobility is a huge generator of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is an incredibly important project for all of us, not only in Canada but globally, to really get right. And so the transition to zero emission mobility, is a huge factor in our ability to reach net zero by 2050. Let's talk a little bit about Canada's auto sector. Now, these numbers might not be very surprising to most of you, but I think it bears some importance to go over them a little bit. Look, Canada's got 5 global OEMs that produce vehicles in this country, and they produce about 1.5 million vehicles each year. The automotive sector is one of the largest manufacturing sectors in Canada. It supports 500,000 jobs directly or indirectly. Entire communities, as we know, are dependent on these companies and the satellite firms that spring up around them, particularly in the parts sector. In 2020, vehicles were the second most exported product in Canada. So it's a huge, huge part of our trading profile as well. And of course, Canada is the 5th largest exporter of vehicles in the entire world. And of course, that speaks largely to the integrated nature of our vehicle sector. North America, as we all know, is an incredibly integrated market when it comes to vehicles, when it comes to most products, but vehicles in particular. You've heard the numbers of how many times parts go across the border every day. This is an incredibly complex and important part of our economy. So I think what that tells me is that if we're going to have a future in the auto sector, at least, that sector has to transition to being zero emission based. If not, then we will lose tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs. And I think as importantly, we're going to miss out on emerging opportunities to create new jobs, to create wealth for future generations of Canadians. It also means that we'll be relying on imports more and more to get to Canada's net zero targets. We all know that, by 2035, sales of internal combustion engine vehicles will be prohibited. So everybody will be forced to purchase a zero emission vehicle in Canada. How many of those vehicles we want produced in Canada? That's a question that we should be asking ourselves. I want to talk a little bit about the emerging opportunity. I've already laid out the context, I think, for this opportunity, but I think it's important to remember, maybe even communicate more loudly, that Canada has got world-leading firms across the entire supply chain in zero-emission mobility, right? So from mining through to producing the active battery materials and battery cells and battery packs, and of course, recycling of battery materials as well. We have companies that are doing this, right? We have companies that are assembling battery packs and obviously building the motors and transmissions for these vehicles and the power electronics and thermal systems. And of course, we have vehicle assembly too, which is an incredibly important part of this entire value chain. And of course, we have companies that are building charging infrastructure and deploying it as well. So what we need to do in Canada to maximize the opportunity is that we need to target the critical and high value added segments of this supply chain. The good news is that we can do it, right? So Canada's got a whole host of advantages that really almost any other jurisdiction would not have, right? We have an established vehicle sector, as I was just talking about. We've got world-class vehicle parts manufacturers. Importantly, we've got clean, renewable electricity across most of this country. That means that we can attract more and more foreign direct investment. You know, institutional investors, for example, are looking to invest and place their money in more sustainable investments. And Canada is one of those places where you know, it makes a lot of sense from an ESG perspective. It's an ESG advantage that we've got. We've got access to, you know, the most important markets for us, obviously the United States, but also Europe and Asia. We've got free trade agreements that allow us to leverage markets. And look, peace, order, and good government, and that's what that beaver in the middle of the screen is meant to signify. This is a really important and maybe understated part of this. Canada's got the predictability of the rule of law. We've got regulations that make sense. I know that everybody can gripe about this regulation or that regulation, but on the whole, they're meant to promote fairness and predictability, and they do that by and large. And Canada is one of the few places in the world where you can say that. So we've got peace, order, and good government. So investors like that as well. So these are really important components of what Canada's advantages, excuse me, is. And of course, we've got a critical mineral advantage, right? So this is a map, and those astute will see that this was a Government of Canada map that I just bore because it's so well done. But this displays for you some of the, you know, the deposits and the activities that Canada has got, you know, throughout the critical mineral supply chain. And of course, we, you know, the Government of Canada is embarking on a supply chain strategy right now, which is going to be really important, not only for mobility, but for other battery usages as well. You know, you can just sort of see we've got the deposits for, you know, most of the critical minerals already, and the rare earth minerals that it takes to make these vehicles, to make the batteries, to make the magnets and the motors, and the light white alloys. So Canada has got this, and other countries in the Western Hemisphere don't. Not all of them anyway. They certainly don't all have an auto sector. They certainly don't all have peace, order, and good government. So these are huge advantages, and of course, sustainable power as well. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the recent developments that you know, sort of form a baseline of success going forward. We've seen these, and for many of you, these won't be news, but you know, it sort of displays, at least for me, the interest that the world has got in Canada. And I have to give huge credit to the federal government and also to the governments of Ontario and Quebec for initiating these relationships internationally and selling Canada and talking about the advantages that we have got relative to other jurisdictions. And so these are just some of them, you know, but it spans, you know, not only assembly of vehicles, but it's, you know, battery materials, it's battery assembly, it's mining as well. And this will mean new jobs, of course, and mean new investment in communities that already rely on you know, the large auto sector. These are some more recent developments. The one up top, I think, is clearly the most recent one, the MOUs between Canada and Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz to really lock up some battery materials for those companies, hugely important for their vertical integration strategies. I won't dwell too much on some of the headlines here. I think it just really does show that there's a lot of activity and a lot of traction that we're seeing in this broad supply chain in Canada. And of course, most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, a huge opportunity for Canada, allowing Canadian critical minerals obviously from free trade partners of the United States to be included in batteries, and for those batteries and those vehicles to for Canadian materials to be included in vehicles that will be subsidized for purchase in the States. It's a huge opportunity. It provides predictability for the Canadian market, and I think investors are going to see that the mining opportunities and the vehicle opportunities, the battery opportunities in Canada are for real, that there's stability and predictability for these countries or for these companies. And you're going to see a lot more activity and interest in coming months and years. So this is a huge deal. And obviously, if it had gone the other way, it would have been, frankly, crippling for the Canadian industry all the way across the supply chain from upstream to downstream. So, huge credit to our diplomats and to industry and to policymakers at the federal level in particular for I think, educating folks on Capitol Hill and obviously in the administration and ensuring that there's a really high level of knowledge of how highly integrated this industry already is and needs to be going forward. But I've talked about all the opportunities and the enthusiasm. There are challenges, and some of these challenges are pretty obvious, and some of them are very real. Look, it's not helpful when there's war disrupting global supply chains. It's not helpful when people are cold and they're worried about their EVs starting in the winter or have range anxiety. It's not helpful when we haven't figured out how to work with First Nations to access the critical materials that we're going to need to make the batteries of the future. Although I will say there's been a lot of advancement on that file as well. And look, the biggest challenge here is the materials challenge. There are not enough raw materials in the pipeline to take the majority of OEMs beyond 2030. So this is, I think, the crux of my point. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There are people lining up to buy EVs. The wait lists, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, are 2.5 years long. So there's no shortage of demand. But we have a supply challenge. It's not just in Canada, it's globally. We're seeing gigafactories pop up around the world and huge competition to land these gigafactories, and Canada has been successful in landing some of this interest, and this is all really good. But we haven't seen anywhere near the type of investment, $500 billion for 285 gigafactories around the world. We haven't seen anywhere near that kind of investment in the mining side. So if you're not mining the lithium and the graphite and the manganese, et cetera, to make these batteries, I'm not sure what's going to be shipped to the gigafactories to make the batteries. So I think it's a really important point to dwell on. There is not enough supply right now to make the batteries, to make the vehicles. So that's a huge challenge that we're all going to have to come to grips with. And look, the media is picking up on this as well. That is something that I'm sure people on this call will need to think about too, because we're all enthusiastic and hopeful that people will be driving EVs sooner rather than later. But we don't want people to get discouraged when they see headlines like, well, the EV revolution isn't happening because you can't get the metals to power the machines. This one from The Economist is from last week. Could the boom run out of juice? Maybe, quite possibly, because we don't have enough batteries. Hugely, that's popular media, and that is influential as well. But they're not wrong. There's just not enough investment in mining yet, whether it's in Canada or globally, to shore up supply for these batteries. I just want to go back to the big wild statement I made at the beginning of this presentation, and that was that Canada will be a global zero-emission vehicle giant in 2040. So if I go back to that list of what that could look like, are we going to be producing and processing the materials and the critical minerals and rare earth minerals? Are we going to be, assembling, zero-emission vehicles with a certain percentage of Canadian content, et cetera, et cetera? Are we going to do some of these, or are we going to do all of these? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves now. We have to ask, okay, how are we going to do it? If what we've decided on doing as a country, what the priorities are, how are we going to do it? And what investments need to be made to accomplish that? And what incentives are going to catalyze activity and bring in more investment? What legislation, whether it be federal or provincial or regulation, needs to be addressed to ensure that companies can be active in this space, and that obviously the demand side is there as well. This is the zero-emission vehicle challenge facing Canada. And the reason I write that is I don't really think we have a huge demand side challenge. I think it's really good that we're incentivizing people that different jurisdictions across the country are doing that. I think it's right to focus on educating people that that EVs, for instance, are not only a viable mode of transport, are really the way of the future. But I think it's really a supply challenge, and I think it's a challenge that Canada is really well positioned to take on. But to do so, we need to be purposeful in how we approach it, right? So we need to coordinate as an industry with government and with civil society, by which I mean academics and NGOs, et cetera, and media, not media on the strategy, but to educate Canadians. We need to really coordinate and align so that we can come up with a comprehensive strategy that encompasses the sustainable development of our minerals and our and it's not just extracting the minerals, it's processing them as well. That really focuses on First Nations partnerships. This is a huge opportunity for economic reconciliation. That focuses on battery research and development and manufacturing and recycling. And that also focuses on zero emission vehicle manufacturing to make sure that our auto sector is not only maintained, but is future proofed, that it will be relevant 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And we have to define what the roles for public and private investment are in this. How much role, what's the role of government, and not only investing, but also obviously on the public policy side, but what's the role in attracting private investment, whether it be institutional investors or private equity, et cetera. How are we going to incentivize and attract that kind of investment? And this is important because other countries and other jurisdictions are doing that. So Norway, Finland, obviously, the UK, France, and Germany, the United States, Australia, all of these countries have focused their attention and resources on developing strategies of the future in their zero emission vehicle sectors. Often it's battery focused because they don't have everything that Canada has got. They might be missing the mining, they might be missing the auto sector, but they have been working, with industry, with government, with civil society to develop strategies to compete and win. And they have been investing huge sums of money to ensure that they're, part of this transition to zero emission mobility, and to make sure that their supply chains are set up for the future. And you're already seeing this pay dividends. They've already set goals on the number of people who will be employed in the battery market. For example, in the European Union, they want 600 million people employed in that market by the end of the decade, for example. They have already set their sights on what the future looks like for their jurisdictions. So the message here is that Canada needs to strategize to ensure that we're not left behind. And the good news is that we can do this. We can develop a world-leading strategy. We can start today. We can set targets for the future, for 5 years from now, 3 years from now, really, and for 10 years from now, for 2040. We can know what success looks like. We can define that, going back to the list of what it is we want to be in this space. We can define that together, and we can set targets. So that's really what my message is, I think, today. It's about building a national supply chain strategy, which is really what Accelerate was formed to help do. And this is a strategy that would create the focus and alignment and project pipeline that would be necessary to secure our future in the global auto sector, right? So we need to sort of, ask ourselves, what percentage of global lithium, for example, does Canada want to be responsible for, or global nickel production, battery nickel production? And you go down the list of critical minerals, what percentage or how many gigawatt hours of battery cell production does Canada want to be responsible for? And we have to ask ourselves the question and then sort of say, okay, well, what would it take for us to get there? We can work backwards from that. How much money will that take? How much time will it take? Where will these things be developed? How many people are going to be employed, et cetera, et cetera? If we answer those questions, we know where we're going. We know what success can look like across the entire value chain in our supply chain. So that's really what I think Canada needs to do to ensure that we are successful in this new world of zero emission mobility. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I guess I come back on screen, and Tim, we have a conversation.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
But just before I pass this over to Jason, who will take a look at some of the questions that have come in, I'm just curious. So, I mean, I think you've captured really well and explained fairly clearly what Canada's sort of inherent advantages are in this EV race. How are we doing though? Like versus other countries? Is Canada? Are we like if you had to rank, where would we be? Because I mean, that includes political will and all the rest of it.
Well, I think the good news is that we have the political will now. I think you're seeing a lot of activity, particularly at the federal level, but also in Ontario. But I think that at the federal level in particular, you're seeing a lot of political capital being spent on this. And that's a really good news story. I think the challenge for Canada is other countries have got a head start. I mean, obviously China is in a different league altogether, and they, had seen this coming for frankly, decades. But other countries, Europe, formed the European Battery Alliance 5 years ago to bring together industry with government to figure out what their strategy is going to be. Same thing with Australia. They've had a battery strategy for a number of years now. So Canada is starting a little bit behind in this race, and it is a race. It's both a sprint and a marathon. We need to kind of go quickly, but also set ourselves up for the long run. But there's good news and there's less good news. The good news, as you say, is that the political will is there. The political capital is being spent, and of course, we have all of those advantages that I discussed. The less good news is that we're starting from a position of less strength, but I don't want to say weakness, because I actually think that we can catch up. I think we can be really relevant. I think we can sort of mobilize ourselves fairly quickly. To your question about where do we rank, I mean, that's hard to say, because I think it's a different, maybe a different paradigm. As I said before, Canada has got everything it takes to be, really relevant across the entire value chain. And in fact, we're probably the only country that can have a full-scale, comprehensive zero-emission vehicle supply chain strategy, right? Other countries can have a battery strategy. Other countries could maybe have an assembly strategy or whatever it might be, focus on the midstream and battery materials, for example. We can do all of that because we have the minerals and we have the, a nascent but, growing battery industry. We have the auto sector, and we've got human capital. We've got people who know how to build things in this country. And as you say, we've got the political will. So I actually think that we can do a really good job here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to call on Jason. Jason, would you mind taking a peek and see if we've got some questions there we can tackle?
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Matthew. So, Matthew, there are a few questions that I think are tangential to your talk today, but they are fairly highly voted. So feel free to answer or feel free to pass if they are, kind of outside of your realm. The first one is about everyone's favorite topic, charging and charging networks. Harriet says, I find it frustrating needing to belong to all the different charging stations. Is there a plan in place to eventually amalgamate them all?
Well, I'm tempted to pass because I don't know the answer to that. A big part of what will need to happen, of course, is, and I think your members and the people on this call know this better than anyone, is we do need to have comprehensive charging infrastructure in this country, and that's everything from charging stations, and I get Harriet's point, but it's frequency of charging stations and its transmission of power, right? So that charging is not just on the highly traveled corridors, that you can get reliable charging everywhere you need it in the country and fairly quickly, because that's the infrastructure part of uptake. So I don't know the answer to the question, but I am sensitive to it, and I think it's a really important point, because I think one of the challenges that was highlighted in my presentation was, a lot of Canadians who are not already sort of converted psychologically to electric mobility really do worry about charging, do worry about getting caught somewhere and not, having enough juice to get home or to get to where they need to go. So I'm sensitive to that, and our members such as Flow and ChargePoint are working on these solutions as well.
Yeah, and Harriet, I'd say two things. I'd say if you haven't already, all of our past webinars are on YouTube, and you can check out our YouTube channel. And we've had several other presenters that have talked about charging and charging networks. And personally, I know that the charging providers are working together to make interoperability easier and smoother, closer to the Tesla kind of plug-in charge experience. So the next question from Keith loops back to what you and Tim were just talking about. Says, I know better late than never, but it seems obvious to me that most of this should have been started 5 years ago. And it's hard to give too much credit when so many others have already gotten started. Why do you think it took Canada so long to get more focused on policy?
Well, I think what's interesting about Canada and our sort of political history is that we have not actually focused on industrial policy very much. I mean, you could argue that, say, the oil sands, were a product of industrial policy. Nobody really called it that at the time, but it was a concerted effort to build an industry. That's kind of the only example I can sort of think of where Canada sort of, as a government and as an industry have worked together to kind of build something like this. So we don't have that muscle in Canada, right? Other places do. Germany has got that muscle. South Korea has got that muscle. See, China's got that muscle. They do it a different way, and as a result of that, they've been able to, and Norway's got that. A lot of the Nordic countries have got those muscles. So as a result, they've been able to build industries kind of seemingly out of scratch. Sometimes it takes years, of course, but they know what they're driving at, what they're trying to build, and what success looks like. In Canada, we don't do things like that. And I alluded to a little bit earlier in my presentation. We've been very blessed with the natural resources and with the infrastructure that was built by generations of Canadians. So we haven't really kind of had to do it in the same way. So I think that's part of the answer. I do think that there is a realization now, though, that if we want to compete, and it is a competition, and I hate to pit everything as a competition, but it is, because there's only a finite amount of investment money that's going to go into this. Then we're going to need to align and be purposeful here and know what success is. So, it is a bit frustrating. I wish we were having this conversation 5-7 years ago, but you know what? I don't think anybody really saw the EV revolution or the zero emission vehicle revolution happening as quickly as it is, really. I mean, Tesla obviously, put this in a bit of hyperdrive, but I think there were a lot of, doubters even 3-4 years ago. And so, I'm willing to give some people some slack, but I will say there is a bit of frustration that this conversation wasn't happening earlier.
Great, thank you. This is an interesting one because it's a hot button topic. How does hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells contribute to, ZEV adoption?
It is hot
buttons. To add my 2 cents.
Yes.
How do the supply chain challenges for hydrogen differ versus pure battery?
Well, I mean, I think there are real differences in the hydrogen refueling infrastructure that's needed, and I think that is part of what our big strategy has to be, right? So what role does hydrogen play? Is it passenger vehicles? That doesn't seem to be the way things are going, right? Is it heavier duty vehicles and transportation? That seems to be a more popular notion. And so there's a lot of really great work being done on hydrogen and developing the fuel cells for mobility. So the answer to the question is it plays an important role. I think when it comes to the popularization of zero emission vehicles, i.e. you and me and people in this call driving zero emission vehicles, I think it's most likely to be battery electric, right? But I think that there's an important role for hydrogen to play for heavier duty transportation. And then there's an infrastructure issue there too. I mean, you got to get refueling stations, you've got to get hubs built. But it is a different challenge than say charging stations for electric vehicles. But I do think it plays an important role.
Okay, great, thank you. Comment from Brian. This is related to one of your earliest slides. Why 2040? Might as well plan for 2240. Set visions and goals for 5 years out, otherwise you lose everyone's attention.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't disagree at all. I mean, I think, you know, as I said, it's both a sprint and a marathon. So I think you need to kind of have what your vision is longer term, but have targets along the way. And I don't think they're just sort of, you know, here's a milestone 5 years from now, you know, we're going to have, you know, version 2 of the strategy written. I think you actually have to have hard numbers against which you're measuring yourself, right? So going back to my lithium example, and by the way, I don't know what the answer is. I think industry and government have to work together on this. But just to illustrate my point, if we were to say by 2040, Canada's going to be responsible for 15% of global lithium production, and that's not just the extraction, but it's the processing. Well, what does that mean by 5 years from now? Well, does that mean that we're responsible for 3%, or that we've got one mine, you know, we won't have a mine developed in 5 years, but, you know, well on the way to approval, and we know when ground is going to be broken, et cetera. Is it 2 mines? Is it 3 mines? You know, what about lithium brines? And my point is, I think you can have short-term goals with a longer-term vision.
Great, thank you. This one again is a bit of a tangent, but asks about how about bidirectional charging to support the grid and electrification of homes, businesses, industry? Government needs to incentivize this as well.
Yeah, look, I agree that bidirectional charging can be an important solution. I don't have a comment on what incentives need to be put in place by governments at the moment. I think you know, you probably will see that kind of incentive coming online over time. I think it's a really neat technology. I think it can actually solve quite a number, or at least address a number of challenges here, because you are going to get some grid challenges, some transition challenges, and you know, there are concerns about drain on the grid. I think those things will be solved by smart people over time. I'm not as worried about that, to be very frank, but I think bidirectional charging is a really neat technology, and you know, whether governments will incentivize that or not, I don't know, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
Okay, back to minerals. Though almost half of Tesla EVs produced in Q1 had no nickel or cobalt in the batteries, do we need to be pursuing nickel extraction in remote, expensive, and environmentally destructive processes?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And there are a couple of things in that question. So one speaks to the development of battery technologies that are different from what we have today. And I think Canada needs to be really smart in its strategy to make sure that we are, to borrow Walter Gretzky's, quote, we know where the puck's going. So we're not making the batteries for 2025, we're making the batteries for 2035. And I think that that's a really important point. To the question about, or to the point about environmental degradation, I think it's a very fair point. I think, though, we have to remember that Canada actually has much higher standards than pretty much everywhere else in the world, every other mining nation. And so that's not to say that it doesn't come with an impact. It does, but relative to how others do it, whether it be environmental impact or social impact, Canada does it better than elsewhere. And so I think we also need to realize that Canada has a role to play in leading on the mining side, in doing it in as sustainable a way as possible, as environmentally sensitive a way as possible. You're always going to need, I think, minerals and metals to operate these vehicles. What the battery technology looks like, I can't predict, but it's a fair point. It is changing. But I think that we also have to acknowledge that mining is going to be a part of this, and it might as well be done in Canada where it can be done as responsibly as possible.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. Catherine asks, are we factoring in the fact that oil is running out, and how do we plan to run all of the equipment in factories that will need carbon-based fuels to operate?
Well, look, I was at Tim and I actually talked about this webinar for the first time in Sudbury when we were both at a conference, discussing battery electric vehicles in the mining sector. And there is a tremendous amount of innovation in that space. So you're seeing a lot of mines that are just being run on electric equipment now, and so that there more mines are not run on electric equipment, but you're seeing the capacity come online. And I can't remember all my stats, and Tim, you might remember more. But it's something like 7 to 10% of mining equipment now is electric, and it's just growing exponentially. There's a huge competition for space in this space, rather. And in fact, Canada's leading the way. There's some great companies, McLean Engineering, for example, one that builds all electric mining equipment. So look, it's a great point. Can it happen quickly enough? No, you're still going to be using fossil fuels to run the mines for some time, but you're seeing a lot of development in that space.
As a matter of fact, we do have a speaker coming up, and I don't have the schedule in front of me. I think it's the November webinar, which will be, I think, fascinating, and it will highlight how Canada, the technology that we're applying in the mining sector is pretty remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about, anybody who knows what tailings are, we've had decades of tailings piling up, and suddenly they can be mined economically. And we're going to talk with someone who's in that field, and it's all so that they can, get the materials needed for electrification. So I think it'll be a good talk, and it plays exactly off what you were just saying, Matthew.
Fantastic.
Tim, is that Nadia?
Yes, it is.
Yes, December 6th, mining and EV materials in Canada.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, next one. This may be another tangent, but it is certainly timely. Does it make any sense to add a luxury tax to any green vehicle?
Does it make sense to add a luxury tax to any green vehicle? I'm going to pass on that. I don't know. It probably makes more sense to incentivize people to buy these vehicles in the first place, and what that threshold between incentivization and tax is. I don't know what the exact number is, but.
Okay. Back to mining then. What's the bigger challenge for Canada, mining the materials or processing them to obtain battery grade products?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be slightly annoying in saying both. I will say that the more immediate opportunity is probably in processing, but only because it takes so long to open up a mine, right? And so you can open up processing facilities in a relatively shorter period of time. It still takes a fair amount of time. Processing materials is a huge opportunity for the country. The challenge there, though, is that if you're not mining the materials in Canada, then you're importing the materials to process, right? And so there's a lot that goes into that. One, you're not investing in your mining it, and two, you're not doing a heck of a lot for our emissions profile if you're putting these things on boats that are powered by fossil fuels and processing them in Canada. But that said, that's been Europe's strategy, right? So they're focused on processing the materials because they don't have the mining capability the same way that a Canada would. They have some, obviously. So as they wait for the mining to come online, they're focused on the processing. So I think in the shorter term, that's a huge opportunity for Canada, but we would be remiss if we didn't do both. And in fact, we'd be remiss if we didn't do all of it. I think that was the point of my entire presentation. So they're both immense challenges, though, because you're also, these things are billion-dollar plays, right? And so you're trying to attract investment for processing just as you are for mining. So it's a competition there. So they're both huge challenges.
Great. Apologies if you mentioned this and I missed it. The question from Scott says, you displayed a map showing how much money other countries have spent, but no Canada. How much has Canada spent to attract battery and vehicle manufacturing?
Yeah, No, it's a great question. So to be honest, I haven't done my arithmetic because different announcements have shown different numbers, and some announcements haven't shown any numbers. So it's really hard to know. You know, when you know an LG or a BASF comes and says that they're going to invest $3 billion, $5 billion in a factory, that's great. How much money are we putting up against that to incentivize that investment? Sometimes it's not made public for a very variety of reasons. A lot of them are commercially sensitive reasons. So I don't know the full answer to that, but I do know that, like, for example, in the federal budget, you know, $3.8 billion has been dedicated to a critical mineral strategy, right? So that's a lot of money. I mean, is it enough? We're going to see, but it's certainly a good start. You know, we are investing, you know, through these by trying to attract these FDI investments, you know, hundreds of millions, you know, and sometimes billions of dollars. But I don't have the arithmetic on it. But I think that might speak to a larger point, and one that, you know, maybe I was trying to make in my presentation. We haven't set a number against this. We haven't said Canada is prepared to spend $50 billion, $100 billion, $200 billion to create this industry for the country. And as a result, we don't exactly know how much we're spending relative to others who have announced that publicly.
Okay. The next one is a question from Sue, and it's a bit of a tangent, but it's a question we get a lot. So I'll just quickly tackle it. She asks, what about the supply of hydro to power these vehicles? The current grid does not have the extra capacity to power 100% battery powered EVs. And I'll tackle that two ways. Do not confuse 100% of sales with 100% of vehicles on the road. Even once we hit the date where 100% of sales are electric, you're still going to have gasoline vehicles aging on the road over 10, 15 more years. And the hydro companies know this. They're in good shape right now for EV capacity, and they're putting upgrades in place. We've had them on the webinar talking about it already. They know this is coming, and they're putting upgrades in place to make sure that they can continue to sell us as much hydro as we need, because face it, that's their business. They want to sell us more power.
Yeah, I think too that, well, you're absolutely right. The grid's not ready for that, but there's still quite a long time between now and when we're at 100% EVs. And as I said, I think earlier, those problems will be ironed out over time, and new power will be brought online. The bigger challenge, as I understand it, is transmission of the power to more remote areas of the country, where, you know, if this is going to happen, it has to be everybody driving an EV or a zero emission vehicle. The other thing that I think about too, though, it's not just the charging of the vehicles; it's powering the infrastructure to make all the stuff that we need to make vehicles, right? So mining, for example, if we're going to be opening up new mines, well, they are in remote parts of the country, and they're not serviced, whether it's hydro or water or, you know, broadband. And so, you know, these are the costs of opening up a mine. I mean, there's also, you know, human capital costs. You got to employ people to go down there, but like, you got to service these things. And so, you know, that's going to be a huge investment for the country. So absolutely readying the grid for the consumer, for the driver, readying the grid for the manufacturing of these things, if we're going to be serious about this, is going to be another huge task. So it's new mines, new processing facilities, new manufacturing facilities for the parts and the batteries and potentially even more vehicle assembly plants. You know, if we're going to get it right, it's going to require a lot of power.
Hey, Jason, do we have one more, or are we pretty much through them, do you think?
Yeah, I'll ask one more. Gordon asks, is being great at recycling and having materials sent to Canada for recycling fiscally attractive? How far away is too far away to be economical to send here?
Well, you know, I'd have to ask, you know, Lithion or even Stelco, members of ours that do the recycling. how they've broken down their math. I don't know the answer to that. What is economical versus not economical? I'd imagine like everything, the closer you are to your source material, the more economical it is. You're seeing recycling those spring up around the world. The good news is that Canada Li-Cycle is another one of these. Canada is actually really doing great things when it comes to building recycling facilities in different parts of the world. I mean, we're seeing some of our companies really kind of I guess increase their profile internationally. So it's very possible that actually Canadian companies have got recycling facilities in South America and Africa and Asia, and the IP all belongs to Canada, and we're benefiting that way too.
Great.
Awesome.
Well, thanks. I think we're at that point where we should probably wrap things up. And Matthew, I have to say thank you very much for coming on. And for me, I think what the biggest takeaway I have is kind of a better appreciation for how many moving parts there are to this story. I mean, yeah. And everything has to work in concert and has to happen at the right time. It's a tremendous undertaking to in order for us to take advantage of this huge transition. And I think you sort of displayed that really well in touching on all these different players involved in the process. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks so much, Tim. And if I had sort of one message to leave everybody with, it's, this transition is happening. It has to happen. Canada's in a great place to take advantage of this as well. So while we're trying to do good, we can do well, right? We can make money, we can create jobs, we can create futures for the next generations of Canadians by developing the supply chain. So thanks so much for letting me, talk about it.
Yeah, thank you. And Jason, thanks a lot. Always great at the Q&A and filtering, and it's not as easy as it looks, because I know that the Zoom platform, things jump around. Just when you get your eyeball on a question, it disappears and goes somewhere else. And thank you for filtering them, because we do get questions that sometimes are kind of off the mark. I'll say, by the way, that we do have an episode up on our YouTube playlist where we had Li-Cycle as a guest speaker. So if you're interested in learning about recycling of batteries in Canada, that episode's available for you to watch.
Terrific.
Yeah. So we've recently heard from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association about electrification of transport, but imported vehicles actually make up, depending on the number you look at, around half of all the car sales in Canada. So next month, we're going to be hearing from David C. Adams, who is president and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. So this is sort of the import side of things. Be sure to mark the date. It's Tuesday, October 4th at 7:30 p.m. Still DST, I guess, or Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all for joining us on today's episode. It means a great deal that so many of you sort of loyally follow our webinar each month, and it makes it fun for us. We really appreciate your participation. Feel free to write us, send any questions or comments, criticisms or praise. We'll take it all, and we'll work with it and try and make things better. So from all of us at Electric Vehicle Society, and until next time, stay well. This will conclude tonight's webinar.